Part 1, The Beginning of a Storm. Book, The Silent Death. On April 6, 1887, Ivan Kramskoy, one of Russia's most celebrated painters and the conscience of an entire artistic generation, was found dead in his studio. He had been working feverishly on a portrait of a doctor when, suddenly, his brush slipped from his hand. His head slumped forward onto the canvas. His heart had failed him. And there, frozen in silence, surrounded by the faces he had painted, peasants, tsars, writers and mysterious wanderers, the man who gave Russian art its moral voice, died exactly as he had lived, in front of the canvas in the grip of his own obsession. But to understand the power and tragedy of Kramskoy's life, you must go back, to a boy from a poor family who dared to challenge an empire. Childhood in Ostrogozhsk. Ivan Kramskoy was born in 1837 in the provincial town of Ostrogozhsk, far from the grandeur of St. Petersburg. His family was poor, his father a petty official. Life was harsh, ordinary and narrow. But Ivan was different. As a child, he would sit for hours sketching faces in the dirt with a stick, tracing the silhouettes of neighbors against the glow of lamplight. He was fascinated by people, not just how they looked but the secrets behind their eyes. There was no money for luxuries, yet the boy's talent was undeniable. A local icon painter noticed him and gave him his first lessons. Icons taught him more than technique. They showed him that art could carry moral weight, that a single face could speak of eternity. It was a lesson he would never forget. The dream of St. Petersburg. At 16, restless and hungry for more, Ivan left Ostrogozhsk with nothing but a few coins and a burning determination. He walked and begged his way to St. Petersburg, the empire's cultural heart. There he entered the Imperial Academy of Arts, a place of tradition, strict rules and glittering careers. But Kramskoy was not dazzled. He quickly grew impatient with the Academy's rigid system. He didn't want to paint flattering portraits of generals and mythological gods. He wanted to paint truth, peasants, workers, ordinary faces filled with suffering and dignity. Already a storm was brewing inside him. The Revolt of the 14. In 1863 the storm broke. The Academy announced its annual competition. Students were to paint mythological subjects chosen by the professors. But Kramskoy and a group of like-minded students rebelled. They demanded freedom to choose their own themes, subjects drawn from Russian life, not ancient Greece. When the Academy refused, Kramskoy led a protest. 14 students, including him, walked out of the Academy in open defiance. This became known as the Revolt of the 14. It was not just an artistic protest, it was a declaration of war against the old order. The young rebels would form the Peredvizhniki, the Wanderers, a revolutionary art movement that brought paintings out of the palaces and into the towns and villages of Russia. For the rest of his life, Kramskoy would be their leader, their conscience, their voice, their storm. The lonely leader. But leadership came at a cost. Kramskoy was not just a painter. He became a symbol, the man who demanded truth in art, who fought against servility and flattery. Writers like Tolstoy admired him. Critics feared him. Students idolized him. And yet he was haunted by loneliness. He painted portraits of his comrades, of peasants, of wandering strangers. His most famous works, Christ in the Desert, The Unknown Woman, The Contemplator, all show figures trapped in deep silence, faces burdened with thought. They were reflections of himself, Ivan Kramskoy, the man who carried the weight of conscience, alone. Closing of Part 1. From a poor boy in Ostrogozhsk to the leader of a movement that shook Russian art, Kramskoy's rise was meteoric. But with every step upward came greater inner conflict. For he was not merely painting portraits, he was painting questions. About faith, about society, about truth. And those questions would consume him until his final breath. Part 2, The Rise of the Wanderers. The birth of a movement. After the Revolt of the 14, Kramskoy and his comrades faced exile from the Academy. No scholarships, no patrons, no imperial approval. For many it could have been the end. But Kramskoy transformed failure into revolution. With fiery conviction, he gathered the young rebels and declared, "We will not beg for their approval. We will carry our art to the people themselves." From this defiance was born the Peredvizhniki, the Wanderers. They created traveling exhibitions, moving from city to city, bringing art not just to the elite, but to teachers, peasants, merchants and workers. For the first time, ordinary Russians saw their own lives reflected on canvas. And at the center of it all stood Kramskoy, not only a painter but a leader, a conscience, a relentless voice demanding honesty in art. The conscience of an age. Kramskoy's brush became a mirror. He painted peasants with dignity, intellectuals with torment, and strangers with unsettling depth. His portrait of Leo Tolstoy captured not the great writer's fame, but his moral storm, a man torn between spiritual duty and worldly success. Tolstoy later said Kramskoy had painted the truth of my soul. But Kramskoy was merciless even with himself. He believed artists had a duty to society. To paint beauty for its own sake was vanity. To flatter power was betrayal. And yet, the burden of this duty weighed on him like chains. Christ in the Desert, a mirror of his soul. In 1872 he unveiled his masterpiece, Christ in the Desert. The canvas showed Christ seated on a barren rock, wrapped in silence and loneliness, staring at the ground with a face of unbearable torment. It was not a triumphant Christ. It was not a God of glory. It was a man alone in the wilderness struggling with doubt and sacrifice. Viewers were shocked. Some saw it as blasphemy. Others whispered that it was Kramskoy himself, his self-portrait disguised as Christ. And in truth it was. The painting was his confession. His Christ was not distant and divine. He was human, burdened, and haunted by conscience. Just like Kramskoy. The Unknown Woman, a mystery in the snow. But perhaps the most enigmatic of all his works came later, The Unknown Woman, 1883. A woman rides in a carriage through the snowy streets of St. Petersburg. Her gaze is cold, distant, proud, yet filled with sorrow. Who was she? A courtesan? An aristocrat? A symbol of Russia itself, beautiful but broken? No one knew. Kramskoy never revealed her identity. The mystery only deepened. Some said she was a ghost, others that she was Kramskoy's own vision of lost beauty in a society rotting with hypocrisy. What is certain is this: the painting radiates unease. The woman's eyes seem to follow you as though accusing you of something unspoken. It was not just a portrait. It was a riddle that still haunts galleries to this day. The burden of leadership. But while his art soared, Kramskoy's soul grew heavier. He was adored by his students, respected by his peers, feared by authorities, but he was always alone. He pushed others to paint truth, but he struggled to live with his own. Letters from his friends reveal a man exhausted by leadership, sickened by hypocrisy, and haunted by death. Every brushstroke was a battle. Every face he painted, a mirror of his own torment. Closing of Part 2. By the early 1880s, Ivan Kramskoy was the undisputed conscience of Russian art. But his conscience was both a gift and a curse. His masterpieces, Christ in the Desert, The Unknown Woman, The Contemplator, cemented his legacy. Yet each work pulled him deeper into darkness. The question remained, how long could a man live when every canvas he painted was a reflection of his own suffering? Part 3, The Weight of Tragedy. A life surrounded by faces, yet alone. By the 1880s, Kramskoy was celebrated across Russia. His portraits hung in noble estates, his name was whispered with reverence in intellectual circles, and the Peredvizhniki exhibitions drew crowds of thousands. And yet, for all the faces he painted, he remained profoundly alone. His letters reveal an aching solitude. The more people I paint, the less I feel I know them. They look at me with trust, but what they seek in my art I cannot give to them. I only give them a mirror, and mirrors are cruel. The man who had painted Russia's conscience could not escape the torment of his own. Family shadows. Kramskoy married and had children, but his domestic life was shadowed by poverty and illness. His relentless devotion to art meant financial struggles were constant. Commissions brought some relief, yet he often refused lucrative offers if they required flattery or compromise. This stubborn integrity, though noble, left his family in hardship. Friends begged him to accept more work from wealthy patrons. He refused. At home he was distant, consumed by thought. His wife once wrote that Ivan seemed to live half in our world, half in another, a silent, invisible world where every glance carried unbearable weight. The crisis of faith. The more he painted, the more he wrestled with questions of God, morality, and death. His Christ in the Desert had shocked Russia not only because of its raw humanity, but because it revealed Kramskoy's inner battle. He could not reconcile faith with reason, hope with despair. He painted priests and believers, yet confessed in private that he felt abandoned by God. He admired Tolstoy's spiritual searching but found no comfort in it. He wrote in one notebook, "If God exists, he hides behind silence. If he does not, then all our striving is a shadow. Which is worse, an absent God or no God at all?" These words foreshadowed his final years. The Weight of the Unknown Woman. In 1883 he unveiled The Unknown Woman. Crowds were both fascinated and unsettled. The portrait was seen as a scandal, too sensual, too modern, too cold. Critics attacked him. Aristocrats whispered that Kramskoy had mocked their society by painting a courtesan as if she were a queen. But the deeper scandal was internal. That woman, proud, distant, unreachable, was not just a figure of society. She was a symbol of Kramskoy's own despair. Some contemporaries believed he poured into her all the love, beauty, and longing he could never find in life. She was both muse and ghost. A silent accusation on canvas. Death in the studio. By 1887 his health was failing. He suffered from heart pains, exhaustion and insomnia. Yet he refused to slow down. He painted feverishly as though racing against an invisible clock. On April 6 he was working on a portrait of the physician Sergei Botkin. His hand trembled, his chest ached, but he pressed on. Then suddenly his brush fell. His head slumped forward. He collapsed against the unfinished canvas. Ivan Kramskoy, the man who painted Conscience, died at 50 years old, in his studio with the face of another staring back at him from the canvas. It was as though death itself had waited for the moment his hand stopped moving. The funeral. His funeral was crowded with artists, writers and peasants alike. The wanderers carried his coffin. Tolstoy himself mourned. He was not just a painter. He had been a moral compass, a storm, a mirror in which Russia had seen itself. But the silence he left behind was deafening. Closing of Part 3. Kramskoy's last years were filled with shadows. Doubts, poverty, exhaustion and visions that unsettled even his closest friends. Yet in that darkness he created his most haunting works. Paintings that continue to look at us, to question us, long after the man who painted them collapsed into eternal silence. Part 4, Legacy and the Eternal Mirror. The silence after the storm. When Ivan Kramskoy collapsed in his studio in 1887, Russia lost more than an artist. It lost its conscience. For years, he had been the voice that demanded truth when others sought comfort. He had been the restless spirit who would not let beauty exist without meaning. But death did not silence him. If anything, it made his presence more unsettling. His works remained, and they spoke with the same piercing intensity as when his hand was still alive. The wanderers without their leader. The Peredvizhniki carried on after his death, but none could replace him. They were painters, yes, but Kramskoy had been more than that. He was a philosopher with a brush, a storm in human form. Some of the wanderers grew more commercial after his passing, painting pretty scenes for wealthy patrons. Others tried to carry his torch of conscience, but the burden was too heavy. Without Kramskoy's fierce guidance, the movement fractured, like a ship sailing without its compass. The immortal gaze. Today, when you walk through the Tretiakov Gallery in Moscow and stand before his portraits, you feel something strange. It is not just admiration. It is unease. His sitters, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, the peasants, the aristocrats, even the unknown woman, do not simply look out of the canvas. They look at you. It is as though Kramskoy's spirit still lingers in the brushstrokes, demanding that you answer the same questions he asked himself. Who are you? What is your truth? Can you live with your conscience? The curse of the unknown woman. And what of the unknown woman? Her identity was never revealed. Some art historians insist she was a real courtesan. Others say she was an ideal, a phantom, a symbol. But when visitors stand before her, they often report a chilling sensation, as if she were alive, as if her eyes carried secrets too heavy for words. Some whisper that Kramskoy poured so much of his despair into her that she became more than paint. She became a haunting, the ghost of all that was unspoken in his life. A legacy written in shadows. Kramskoy never sought glory. He never wanted flattery nor immortality. Yet paradoxically, by refusing compromise, he achieved both. He remains one of Russia's greatest portraitists, but more importantly he remains a moral figure, a man who proved that art is not decoration but revelation. His canvases are not safe. They are mirrors. And mirrors never lie. The final image. Imagine the scene of his death. A dim studio in St. Petersburg. The smell of oil paint. The unfinished portrait of a physician on the easel. A chair toppled. A brush fallen from lifeless fingers. And in the silence, the painted face of Sergei Botkin staring back at him, the eyes of the living captured forever by the hand of the dead. It is almost as if the canvas itself claimed him. As if Kramskoy, who had spent his life giving others a soul on canvas, had poured the last of his own into that unfinished portrait. Closing words. Ivan Kramskoy's life was not long, but it burned with fierce intensity. He began as a poor boy, defied an empire, gave birth to a movement and died with a brush in his hand. But his true masterpiece was not any single painting. It was the unrelenting demand he placed on art, that it should be honest, that it should confront, that it should hold a mirror to the soul. And so, even now, when you meet the gaze of a Kramskoy portrait, you are not merely looking at art. You are standing face to face with conscience itself. And conscience, like a ghost, never leaves you.